Right, okay. So could I ask Professor Zils to stand in front of the slides and point with his fingers as long as he can stretch out? Right, okay, let's see how it goes. Sorry about that. So the first is about the classification, how to classify the white matter tracts. The second is how to track the different methods, advantages, limitations, very briefly on this, so how we can follow these tracts just like that monkey is following the path. Thank you. It's becoming even more complicated. I have to kind of lean forward. Okay, okay, that's fine. I have a big corpus callosum. I can handle two things with two hands, right? So the third is the applications. Very briefly in the applications, inter-individual differences and asymmetry. And finally, touch upon crossing fibers and final comment on the connectome. So now, how to get out of the jungles? Well, I'm going to give a kits for survival, and there are a few rules. So rule number one, just stay on the path of the pioneers. These guys have studied the white matter tracts, and they told us there are three populations of fibers. There are projection fibers that originate from the cortex and connect to subcortical structures, and vice versa, originate from subcortical structures and reach the cortex. Then there was Vieussens, a few years later, divided up the callosal fibers, the commissural fibers, from the projection fiber. He called that the projection fibers the centrum semiovale, and he separated from the commissural fibers that connect left and right hemispheres. And finally, it was Victor Zier who came up with this sort of distinction between projections, commissural, and association fibers. Now, the second rule is that when you look at the tractography, just follow the colors. Somehow, tractography allows you to see the orientation of these fibers, or the fibers within voxels, and is a color coding. Now I'm telling you what is the color coding. We use green for association pathways, we use red for commissural, and blue for projections. But be careful, because according to what you're looking at, whether the color coding refers to the entire streamlines or just the voxels, you have different informations. So, for example, here you got the arcuate fasciculus. Some voxels are green within the arcuate fasciculus because they have these horizontal orientations, but at some point, the arcuate fasciculus, when it becomes vertical, all of a sudden it change color and it becomes blue and then green again. So be careful, differentiate between streamlines orientations and voxel-based orientations. Now, finally, this is perhaps Miners was the one who put all together, but he also added on some U-shaped fibers. These U-shaped fibers are short association fibers that connect neighboring gyri. Now, this slide is important because first allows me to tell you that projection fiber can further divide into ascending, so coming from subcortical structure to cortex, and these ascending fibers primarily convey sensory information to the cortex. Remember, for example, the main ascending projections are the thalamic projections. The cortex is completely blind for all sensory modality except for the olfactory. So you receive olfactory information directly from olfactory nerves. All the others is mediated by the thalamus. Now, the descending ones are mainly motor, so executive kind of projections. But this rule of dividing and ascending, descending, it doesn't really always apply to all the tracts. You will see later an example of the fornix that connects two subcortical structures, and yet we talk about a projection system. Now, the commissural pathways, again, what is important is primarily these connections are homotopic. So the Brodmann area 44 on the left is connected to Brodmann area 44 on the right, and vice versa. We rarely see heterotopic. The quantity of the component of the heterotopic commissural connections is minimal according to animal studies. And I have to say, there's not much on the tractography, and I wouldn't rely on tractography to divide up in homotopic versus heterotopic. Now, the other thing is that association fibers, you can divide them into feed-forward and feedback connections. And for the U-shaped fibers, probably is the same. We've got feed-forward and feedback, but we don't really know. Now, the rule that, not only follow the path of the pioneers, but actually there is a lot to explore and map, especially when it comes to association fibers and the U-shaped fibers, and I'll give you some example later with that. Now, this is a bit complex, but is extremely important, especially if you are a clinician. So, what is that sort of image is telling you? That there is a segmentations in the white matter that allows you to understand where these tracts run. There is a core central zones where only commissural and projection pathways are located. You will not find association pathway inside that core zones. The association pathways are between the cortex and actually that core regions. And there is a distribution within that sort of outlayers in different types. So the most superficial layer is that the U-shaped fibers, actually, they're shorter fibers, association fibers, occupy the most superficial layer, the yellow one. Then the intermediate fibers that run a bit, skip one gyrus, run a bit deeper, and finally the longest association fibers are the deepest of all. Now, so what it's telling you now, this is an important rule, because it's telling you the more distant are the areas connected by association fibers, the deeper you find them into the white matter. And this is a three-dimensional aspect that clinicians for a long time have actually forgot about it. Now, the other things, and that is getting a bit more complicated, because I don't want to leave you with the idea that actually you have, if association fibers, you only have association syndromes when you have damage to these areas. Now, as you get closer to the cortex, you will find all 4 types of populations. So in other words, if you are in a gyrus, you would always find commissural projections and association fiber, the 3 types of association fibers. The same is not true if you are in the middle, in the core. So rule number 1, projection pathways do not cross the midline, so you will never find projection fibers going through the red patch, the corpus callosum, and vice versa. You will never find commissural pathways going down this blue patch. The third rule is the association pathway, they never cross the central core regions, and finally all 4 fibers population can find in the gyri. Now, are we going to apply these rules for survival to this type of example? So the first type of connection, someone is giving you this. This is a patient who has recovered brilliantly from stroke, and now you see a connection that goes from the internal capsules, crosses, so it's a projections, crosses the midline, and project into the contralateral motor cortex. Now, on the basis of the rules, do you think that is an artifact or is real? Who says an artifact? Raise your hand. Right, thank you. Who says is not an artifact, may be real? Some people say may be real, okay? Right, I'm afraid is an artifact. Second, you got these fibers, association fibers, originating in frontal cortex, going down and then jumping the splenium and projecting to your temporal. Is that real or an artifact? Think about the rules I told you, association pathways, they don't enter the core zones, the commissural. Who says is an artifact? Okay, a bit like. Who says it may be real, this one? Okay, so a few people that say it's made real. Well, actually, the take-home message is that both artifacts. Okay, for the rules of I told you, the association, projection fiber, they don't enter the corpus callosum. Second, you read a lot of papers talking about plasticity, as if the brain is able to rewire. The brain doesn't rewire. These long tracts, the best they can do, they can increase the myelin thickness or reduce, but they don't rewire. So the use of tractography to support this rewiring is wrong. So now let's have a look at the connectome and graph analysis. Now here, this is another example where the commissural fibers that you see there, some of them are homotopic, and some are heterotopic. Now, again, two things. First, there is a lot of commissural pathways that are missing, so there are a lot of things that we don't see. Second, most of the heterotopic, I believe, are artifactual. Now, so be careful when you look at the graph analysis, because the anatomy of the graph might be different from the anatomy of the brain. So, and here again, so the other aspect that I told you is, if you take into consideration this anatomical aspect, you may actually look at situations where actually in the damage, like in this case in the insula, is the same, but actually according to where it projects or what is the white matter tract that is damaged, you may have an insular damage associated with language, if the damage goes superiorly toward the arcuate, an insular damage associated with hemiparesis, motor problems, or an insular damage associated with limbic problem, emotional problems, if the damage at the underlying white matter goes into the limbic pathways. So again, knowledge of the anatomy is important to avoid giving undeserved credits. Now, the other aspect that is really important, you hear people say, well, I don't care because I use probabilistic. It gives me a confidence of the anatomical probability. That's not the case. The probabilistic tracking gives you a kind of a confidence on the reproducibility of your tracking if you repeat it many, many times. But you can see here in these two examples, one tractography deterministic, one probabilistic. Deterministic showing you that is a tract that stops in the middle of the white matter. That is an artifact. There are no tracts that stop in the middle of the white matter. And the probabilistic tracking is showing you that that artifact is highly probable. Right? Here. So it gives you it has nothing to do with the anatomical probability. The same, probably the tract that is most anatomically consistent, the one in the frontal and those that are going up, but this is not showing high probability. So even if you use probabilistic, you still have the same problems. Now, but tractography is the only method that we have to map a tract in vivo. Other methods have advantages and limitations. So we've been using post-mortem blunt dissection for a long time. Sometimes we soak them in brandy, and sometimes we put them in the freeze. No matter what you do, you can still take them out and do blunt dissections, but the moment you kind of break those tracts, you may create artifactual pathways. So, but it's very useful for neurosurgeons to relearn anatomy if they haven't during the medical training. Sorry for the neurosurgeon in the audience. But so the second is the post-mortem staining. Again, that's Flexic, or the market degenerations. Again, very useful, but you have to wait for the patient to die. You have to have a very good team like Professor Zils has to put together and do this kind of work in 10 brains. And then you have the animal work, axonal tracing. But again, in the axonal tracing, you still have the problem that once you inject it and you kill the animal, you transform your 3D anatomy in a 2D anatomy. So still the anatomy has to look at these images and put them together, stock them together. And there is an error in there. So the rule number 6, there is no gold standard in white matter anatomy. Now, so let me just show you the rule number 7, which is the visual nomenclature still in work in progress. There are some tracks that have been added recently, and the ones with the arrows there, the green arrows. Other tracks are still proposed, are still discussed whether we should include them in the official nomenclature or not. And the reasons for that is actually two main reasons. First, some of these tracks come from the monkey work, like SLF 1, 2, and 3, and they only recently been described in humans, using tractography, for example, or postmortem dissections. Others, are really recently described. Now, the other problem is that we always have is the diffusion tensor model that we use to track creates a lot of false negative, doesn't allow you to see the entire anatomy. So it gave us these false impressions that the corpus callosum stops in the middle of the brain, when actually the corpus callosum projects laterally. And the reason is that because when we use the tracking algorithm, we use this information rather than the other. So because of that, there are advanced models, but advanced models have the problem that on one hand they show you more, sometimes they show you too much. So you have now models that create false positives. That's why after the atlas that we've done with Michel and published in 2012, now we embark with Flavio in another atlas where we created these images. This is tractography done with spherical convolutions, where you can see beautifully the crossing, and now you can hope that to map, have a more comprehensive mapping of the brain. Look at how beautiful is the antenna caps when it goes up and reaches the SLF. Now, I'm going to give you just briefly some example in the next 5 minutes. Fornix and amygdalofugal pathways. Still, despite all the problems with tractography, I'm still very impressed by the ability of the tractography to show this type of connection. The blue ones, so the red ones are the anterior commissures. Below the anterior commissure, you got these connections coming from the amygdala and going to the septal nuclei. Then you got the green streamlines from the fornix, again from the hippocampus going to the septal nuclei. Now, what we're seeing here is really the septal nuclei as a major hub that receives informations, limbic informations from amygdala, emotions, or other kind of memories, and transform via these two pathways, transform memories and emotions into physical sensations by releasing all these hormones and substances from the preoptic areas. So here's where some of their memories and emotions are transformed into physical sensations. Another one is the arcuate fasciculus. This is, again, the 3 segments now are in the classifications. The advantage of having 3 segments is because if you look at the arcuate, the left and right, and measure the volume and the number of streamlines, there is no asymmetry. Only when you look and separately the 3 segments, and you see that there is an asymmetry. About 60%, 80% of us are left lateralized, and only 20% are bilateral and symmetrical. That difference depends on genders, so males are much more left lateralized, belong to group 1, and 50% only the males are bilateral or symmetrical, but females 14, 30, and 30. So there is these gender differences, and here you see that actually being bilateral is an advantage for certain tasks like semantic clustering. This has clinical implications because now if you have a stroke to the left and you have a large right long segment, the chances of recovering are 6 months. It's much higher compared to those that don't. And that increases the clinical predictions of classical predictors of stroke recovery from 30 to 60% by taking into account this anatomical pathway. Finally, the U-shaped fibers. Why we haven't mapped the U-shaped fibers? Because we thought there's no point. They are everywhere in the brain. But actually, when we started looking at these U-shaped fiber, we see a pattern, like this connection between precentral and postcentrals. The majority of these U-shaped fibers are in the hand regions. And the reasons why is because, as demonstrated in monkey work, M1 needs connection from S1 in order to learn and consolidate new motor schemas. If you stimulate S1 through these U-shaped fibers, you record in M1 LTP for 90 minutes, long-term potentiation. So this is a mechanism to learn new motor schemes. And what we did here, we looked at the correlation between anatomy as measured by diffusions and performances. And there is a correlation with motor performance, but most importantly, these U-shaped fibers of the hand regions are affected anatomically different in autistic patients with dyspraxia. So here's giving hope for a new target interventions with TMS and coupled with behavioral performances. Now, finally, I can't really resist to say a few things about the connectome. There are two types of connectome, two schools. One is the microscopic connectome. This is very far, but it's the gold standard. That's what we all hope, down to single synapses. But I think that is utopic. We will never kind of reach this. And even if we do, what's the point, really? Because we go to bed with one connectome, and we wake up with a different one. That's the secret of the connectome, is the dynamic changes of the connectome, not its static properties. So I think that is beautiful work, but very impractical. On the other hand, we have to deal with these methods, global measures that are telling you something, give you delusions of having a global, something that you're mastering, complexity, you're taming complexity, but actually, there might be just illusions. And it reminds me of this sort of a connectomic measures that we derive from graph analysis, the neuropsychological studies of the IQ in the 1960s and 70s. What did we learn from this IQ mapping, kind of defining IQ in the populations? Well, very little about how the brain works, but we're still using IQ for practical purposes to define learning disability versus. So maybe one day we will use this sort of connectomic analysis for practical purposes, but actually I don't think are telling us much about the real anatomy. That's because, but there is a way forward, and that is the resolution. That's a common theme that we thought is kind of trying to bring together the two connectomes. And this is when we started 20 years ago. That was the resolution, very blurred. You're on the cerebellum here. You can't see much. The resolution has improved with the human connectome data set, but even the human connectome data set, when you compare to post-mortem imaging, it doesn't have really anything closer to the real anatomy. Here you can even see the white matter inside the dentate nucleus. And you can use different diffusion properties to create contrast, make histological maps, and quantify diffusion properties. But most importantly, at these resolutions, when you are in situations like parallel fibers, well, the scale, the improved resolution doesn't really differ. The estimations that you have at 2 millimeters or at 100 microns is not different. The difference is really when you are in regions with high anatomical complexity. But at this level, you will see streamlines that stop or have gaps in between that probably are due to the presence of Purkinje cells. Certainly, you have this T-shaped that you're only able to see with histology. One T is missing one side because we were not prepared to bifurcate at this level. So we need to really change our tractography methods. And with that, you can now start all over again and validate new tracks and tell whether they are real or not. With that, I stop here. If you're interested to know a bit more about what we're doing in terms of U-shaped fibers and asymmetry of the U-shaped fibers, Francisco has developed an automatic approach. Eta, she is mapping the U-shaped fibers, premotor, precentral and postcentral, and intrajaw fibers, so she's the person to talk. Nayana, she's developing an atlas of U-shaped fibers of the parietal lobe. And then you have Hamad, if you want to know about this ledge runner, is an occipital tract that is important for navigations. And then you can, about language posters and presentation done by Steffi, Claudia, and myself. And with that, I think is the end. Thank you.
Just a quick question. In the corpus callosum, do you believe there are fibers that cross at 90 degrees?
And it depends where in the corpus callosum. Just right in the middle?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Thank you for a provocative talk. I have two questions for you. One is that there's some fibers that are vertical, like the vertical occipital fasciculus, and I was wondering how would you classify them?
Yes.
This is one question. Second of all, as a field, we are likely to discover more fasciculi that are yet undiscovered. And since you noted that there's no gold standard, what should we do as a field to validate new pathways?
Great points. The first question, we have to go back to 19th century, and there are two guys, Minert and Wernicke, who disagreed on the definitions of the association pathways. For Minert, the association pathways are only horizontal. And Wernicke described these vertical occipital tracts, and the two had a disagreement. So that goes back. I would say that the moment we have to agree on the definition of a tract. And I think, vertical or horizontal, that doesn't really matter, as long as they connect two cortical regions within the same hemisphere. The second question, you're absolutely right. But, I think we crucified for 20 years tractography for being not perfect, but actually, even fMRI has been any method that we develop in medicine is imperfect. We're still using X-ray, right? It doesn't show the anatomy of the lungs, and yet it's still something that you can rely on. This is the same thing with tractography. I think complementary methods will give you an indications. Then you come up with these hypotheses, and then you go to your patients, and then you test and go back. If it's an artifact, time will tell. But I think it's, I disagree with the fact that, it's all artifacts. It's not a perfect method. We should really abandon it. It's the only one we have to study in vivo.
Thank you.
So I just had a question about, one of the golden rules the examples that you gave of the artifacts of the corpus callosum going down and stuff like that. So the evidence for that comes from tracing studies in animals, or does it come from the dissections in humans? Because there's no way that you can tell really where that fiber is going with tractography. I mean, in the sense that when you meet the crossing fibers, you can't really tell whether anatomically there's a fiber that is going, that is deviating in a T. Right?
Yeah. So the evidence comes from the corpus callosum. It comes from the commissure pathways. It primarily comes from animal work.
Okay.
And so that's not enough as an answer. And I believe that as the humans, we haven't really evolved much from other animals when it comes to commissure pathways. So that's why I would rely on that data. But even if we have heterotopic, I cannot believe of papers where I see that, you know, a 78-year-old man regrow the splenium fibers in a sort of and the evidence for that is tractography. Even
Yes.
I have a problem to believe that. And I
Of
built a career on tractography.
Of course.
I thank you for the nice talk. You showed some results on the missing right arcuate, and that's very interesting. And I had the same issue with some subjects who couldn't find the right arcuate. But then there was the paper, I believe, from Yetman in 2011, and he could eventually find the right arcuate with probabilistic methods where he couldn't find it with deterministic. So the conclusion there was that it was a methodological artifact. Now, I wanted to, because this is coming up again in your slides, I want to ask, do you believe there is really no right arcuate in these patients, or what's your take on this?
Okay, so here's a different question. So when we did that study, it was with DTR with 2.5 millimeter resolution, etc. So imagine like a landscape with hills and big mountains, right? So when you go for the big mountains, we couldn't find those big mountains on the right hemisphere, but we could find it on the left. Now, we've been using spherical deconvolution for a long time, and we see connections, the arcuate fasciculus on the right hemisphere. But again, they jump Broca's area, they go to the frontal pole. Now, so I don't believe there are no axonal fibers on the right connecting directly Wernicke to Broca's. I believe that with the method that we used at that time, we couldn't see it. I'm pretty sure that when we increase resolutions and we go to postmortem, we'll see those streamlines on the right. But we see much more also on the left. So what I strongly believe is the asymmetry will remain. But definitely, we will see something also on the right.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. That was awesome. I was just wondering, I was recently working with some data studying the contribution of the right cerebellum to language function. So we're looking for white matter pathways that connect the right cerebellum to the left IFG, and of course they're going to be multisynaptic. So right cerebellar peduncle, middle peduncle to the pons, corticothalamic to the anterior thalamus, and then over to the IFG. And I found that if I did each tract independently, there's a lot of excess information that came in that didn't really speak to the parts of that tract that I was interested in. So if I reduce the angular threshold, I could get kind of a false positive tract that went from the right cerebellum to the left IFG. So it's kind of the rules that you came up with, but I found it as a good workaround to see what the actual quality of that tract was in a patient population versus control population. So I was wondering if you could speak to like the validity of that kind of approach, kind of using the limitations of tractography to your advantage in that sense versus...
Okay, so here's the question. Are you using tractography for connectivity analysis or for white matter segmentations? Because here's the point. Sometimes you have to understand the limits of the methods. And I believe that tractography is a good white matter segmentation. In other words, if you put your point into a white matter voxels, tractography will give you an indication of whether that voxels is occupied by your corticopontocerebellar or another tract. But now if you're using it as a connectivity measure to tell me, I have two voxels in the cortex or subcortex, now I want to know whether they're anatomical connectivity, I wouldn't use tractography for that, especially for the projections fibers and visual fibers.
So you think there's like, so I guess the main question I'm asking is what's a good multisynaptic approach where you're looking at maybe two regions connected by multiple pathways?
Viral tracing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
I'm here again because now I'm putting my chairman hat on because I'm co-chairing with these sessions. So it's my pleasure to invite Professor Carl Sills to talk about receptors and the cortex. Thank you.